It's the war that shook the foundations of the world's largest empire. In the aftermath of World War I, a tiny colonized island decided to strike out on its own, to shake off its foreign rulers and chart a new course of national self-determination. The dream was to do so peacefully, relying on the obvious will of her people to make the case for independence. Sadly, though, that dream turned out to be exactly that. An illusion, divorced from the world's cruel realities. No, if Ireland wanted to separate from the United Kingdom, there was only one way it could do so: war. Lasting from 1919 to 1921, the Irish War of Independence was one of the 20th century's first major wars of decolonisation. Pitting the might of the British Empire against volunteer guerrilla bands, it paved the way for generations of late colonial conflicts. Yet there's more to Ireland's fight than just a simple David versus Goliath tale. Taking place mostly in country villages and amid civilian populations, the conflict brought a level of brutality to Irish life that was previously undreamed of. At the same time, it held up a mirror to British society, exposing for perhaps the first time the darkness at the heart of the empire. As 1914 dawned, it was on a United Kingdom that controlled the largest empire the world had ever known. British colonies spread afar afield as Africa, Asia, the Caribbean. Nearly a quarter of all land was under London's dominion, along with a fifth of the global population. Yes, while everything seemed rosy to the empire's masters in Westminster, closer to home, trouble was brewing. On one small island, a pushback was beginning against British culture, against exploitation, against colonization. But this process wasn't taking place in some far-flung country. It was taking place in Ireland, an official part of the United Kingdom. At least in name it was, because the Irish had no illusions about their status within the UK. While this might be a union on paper, it was, in reality, a brutally unequal partnership. English claims to Ireland had begun as early as 1171, when Henry II looked across the Irish Sea and thought, that'll look good in my little collection. What followed had been centuries of increasing interference and exploitation, culminating in the Acts of Union. Coming into force in January 1801, the Acts had permanently joined Ireland to Britain, creating the United Kingdom. But while this had seen some cosmetic benefits, like Irish representation in Westminster or even Catholic emancipation, they hadn't been enough to hide the ugly truth. Rather than a new partner, Ireland's place in the UK was effectively that of a colony. Across the 19th century, as Britain's economy boomed, Ireland stagnated. There were famines, brutally exacerbated by mismanagement from London. Out in the countryside, people lived in the bleakest poverty. The only industry was in the Protestant majority north. In the mostly Catholic south, people were virtually excluded from the riches of the empire. Of course, there were some locals who benefited from the new status quo, not least the landowners with ties to Britain. But for most Irish, the experience was less a marriage of equals and more like a marriage in which their obnoxious British husbands kept loudly calling them lazy and stupid while constantly stealing from their purse. Perhaps it's no wonder then that the late 19th century saw the rise of a new political idea: nationalism. This was the era of self-determination when minority peoples within empires, from Poles to Czechs to Finns, turned to old traditions to unite around a shared ethnic identity. Out in Ireland's countryside, a similar awakening got underway. The Gaelic language was established, schools set up to teach the Irish language. By 1914, Irish nationalism was growing into a potent political force, but it hadn't yet reached the mainstream. Instead, the political centre was firmly occupied by the Home Rule movement and its biggest cheerleader, the Irish Parliamentary Party, or IPP. While nationalists dreamed of an Ireland free from interference by English idiots, the Home Rulers were more pragmatic. They wanted to stay in the UK, but with a local parliament to deal with Irish affairs. And as 1914 dawned, they seemed to be winning. A recent UK-wide election had left the IPP holding the balance of power in Westminster in return for letting the Liberals form a government that demanded Irish Home Rule. Now, we've already covered the ins and outs of this in way more depth for our video on the Easter Rising, so we're not going to go and rehash it here. But the basic summary is that the prospect of Home Rule radicalized Northern Irish Protestants who felt Home Rule was basically code for bending over for the Pope. They mobilized militias which triggered counter-mobilization among Southern Catholics and nearly spiraled into civil war. That it didn't was thanks to a much bigger war breaking out World War I. The First World War put a damper on both Home Rule and the growing tensions. In the rush of patriotism that followed, the IPP encouraged their supporters to fight for Britain, convinced their sacrifice would show the king they were worthy of Home Rule. But not everyone agreed. As thousands marched off to the Western Front, fragments of the nationalist militias who'd refused to fight for Britain suddenly found themselves the only ones left in an Ireland awash with smuggled guns and radical literature. And rather than wait for the king to grant them Home Rule from the goodness of his ossified heart, they had a simpler plan. Why not use this opportunity to claim full independence by force? On Easter Monday 1916, some 1,500 Irish nationalists mustered in Dublin, seizing control of buildings and declared an Irish Republic. To which the British responded with, "Nah," before retaking the city in an orgy of violence. The devastation that befell Dublin was eye-watering. British artillery bombarded the centre. Soldiers conducted door-to-door massacres. By the time the leaders surrendered, 485 people were dead, and tracts of the city lay in ruins. But here's the thing. Rather than blame the British, public opinion in Ireland blamed the Scots who'd launched the Easter Rising. The ringleaders were spat on as they were led through the streets. Had the British left things there, it's doubtful there'd have been a war of independence for us to make a video about. But if there's one thing you can count on in Irish history, it's the ability of the Brits to utterly balls everything up. In the aftermath of the Rising, a wave of executions and raids rocked the island. 3,400 Irish, many of them unconnected to the Rising, were arrested. So violent was the crackdown that IPP leader John Dillon begged the British Parliament, "You are washing out our whole life work in a sea of blood." Unfortunately for moderate nationalism, he was right. Shocked by the crackdown, Irish public opinion quickly swung toward the nationalist radicals. Radicals who, in prison, were becoming ever more radicalized. Many of the arrested ended up in the same jails. Suddenly, guys like Michael Collins, Eamon de Valera, and Terence MacSwiney were coming face to face for the first time, and they were liking what they saw. By the time the British released the prisoners in late 1916 and early 1917, they'd forged a network of like-minded nationalists, a network that now had one goal: to replace the IPP as the voice of the Irish people. The first big test came in 1917. That year, local by-elections were held for 4 Irish seats in the Westminster Parliament, seats that had been held by the IPP and its offshoots for decades. To challenge the moderates, the Republicans latched on to a small political party known as Sinn Fein, meaning we ourselves. They hoped to at least make a decent splash. Instead, they wound up crushing the IPP to take all 4 seats. The results delivered a shot of ice right into the heart of the British establishment. Panic gripped London. Panic that these Irish Republicans might win future elections. But rather than being all like, "Alright, we overreacted last time, and look where it got us. Let's try being calm for once," the Brits were all like, "Time to overreact again, chaps." The wake of the by-elections saw another crackdown. Irish symbols were banned, Sinn Fein volunteers arrested, and radical literature confiscated. At first it seemed to work. In another round of by-elections later that year, the IPP won, just as it always had, and London breathed a sigh of relief. But then Westminster decided this was the perfect time to balls things up all over again. Back in 1916, Parliament had introduced conscription to England, Wales and Scotland to help with World War I, but sensing it might go badly, they'd granted Ireland an exemption. As 1918 began, though, the UK was facing a manpower shortage on the Western Front. Desperate to supplement their forces, the government made its worst decision since the post-Easter Rising crackdown. That April, conscription was introduced to Ireland. Almost immediately, the population erupted. What followed were months of strikes, protests, civil disobedience, and angry public embraces of republicanism. Terrified, the British did what they apparently did best and launched yet another crackdown, but to no avail. That summer, over 100,000 people turned out for Gaelic Sunday, just daring London to try something. Instead, London blinked. Conscription for Ireland was cancelled, but the damage had already been done. That December, in the aftermath of World War I's end, the UK held its first nationwide election since 1910. In Ireland, the results couldn't have been less ambiguous. Sinn Fein won in a landslide. Under Eamon de Valera, who was in jail at the time, the party won 73 seats, including every southern seat except Waterford. The IPP, meanwhile, was decimated, returning only 7 MPs. It was a great realignment, a sign that the age of Home Rule was over. In its place, the age of independence had begun. On the 21st of January 1919, a vast crowd assembled outside Dublin's Mansion House, to watch history being made. Inside, reporters from across the globe jostled for space as Sinn Fein MPs prepared to do the unthinkable. Following the election, the Nationalists had refused to take their seats in Westminster. Instead, they'd convened the Dail Eireann, which was meeting for the first time today. And the first item on the agenda was the declaration of an Irish Republic. It was a momentous day, a day when the South's democratically elected politicians vowed to peacefully split from the United Kingdom. Sadly, that peaceful proclamation was quickly overshadowed by violence. 150 kilometres from the Dáil's opening, two officers with the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC, were transporting weapons through the small settlement of Sola-Hedberg. Founded in 1836, the RIC was the main arm of British power in Ireland, a 12,000-strong policing force made up mostly of Irish-born Catholics. Since they acted on behalf of London, though, many in the Republican movement felt that they represented legitimate targets. And while the newly formed Irish Republican Army hadn't advocated killings, the local units often made their own decisions. And on that day, a unit at Sola-Hedberg had decided to take out the passing RIC officers. The murders of Constables James McDonnell and Patrick O'Connell are today regarded as the opening shots of the Irish War of Independence. At the time, though, it wasn't yet clear that there would be a war. When news broke, nationalists were swift to condemn the killings. The Versailles Peace Conference that ended World War I was currently taking place, and the Dáil was desperate to get the same recognition for Ireland that new states like Czechoslovakia were receiving. Shooting policemen might turn the delegates against them, which is why the first months of the war passed with such limited violence. Even as the Irish failed to receive backing at Versailles, the fragile peace held. Even when a local IRA unit killed 2 more RIC members in May, there was no real move toward war. Perhaps it was naive, but the Dáil really felt they had legitimacy on their side, really felt that London would have to engage with them diplomatically. But, well, when had the British ever listen to Irish concerns? As summer began, an attempt was made to turn up the heat. A nationwide boycott against RIC constables was called. Instead of actually killing them, the plan was to cause social death, to shun constables' wives and kids, refuse to serve them in shops, to pile so much pressure on they'd be forced to quit. As 1919 wore on, the boycott began to really bite, so badly that some police barracks were forced to requisition food supplies to avoid starvation. But while the RIC boycott was the most visible attempt to pressure the British, in the shadows, more sharp-edged tactics were starting to emerge. That same summer, the IRA established its headquarters in Dublin. Soon after, Director of Intelligence Michael Collins formed an assassination unit. Known as the Squad, the unit's mission was to uncover anyone working for British intelligence, especially those working for G Division, the so-called G-men. In previous decades, the Irish cause had been hampered by infiltration. This time, Collins wanted to eliminate anyone who might be talking to London. At first, the Squad arranged the beatings of known G-men to frighten them off. When that didn't work, they turned to assassination. The first targeted was Patrick Smyth, shot several times on his way home on July the 30th. It took till September the 8th for Smyth to die of his wounds, by which time the Squad already had their next target. Daniel Hoey was shot dead on September the 12th. With the second killing, London finally went nuclear. That same day, the British went beyond their already standing bans on Sinn Fein and the IRA by outlawing the Dáil itself. The move was supposed to put an end to Irish dreams of independence. Instead, all it did was close off any peaceful roads out of the crisis. With the Dáil outlawed, the IRA decided to make things official. As 1919 drew to a close, the organisation announced it was now at war with the British. What followed would be bloodshed unlike anything the island had seen for generations. Although its name has echoes of America's Revolutionary War, the conflict that followed wouldn't be marked by set-piece battles or vast armies clashing by night. Rather, it was a guerrilla war, one defined more by small actions, by shootings and burnings, by ambushes on lonely roads. But that doesn't mean it was somehow more civilized. On the contrary, the Irish War of Independence was about as brutal as it's possible to get. Beginning in January 1920, a wave of IRA attacks on RIC barracks began. As the death toll mounted, 8 constables were killed in March alone, compared to 19 across the whole of 1919. The RIC abandoned their positions, falling back to concentrate in larger, more defendable bases in the cities. At the same time, the boycott was doing its job. More and more RIC men were quitting, unwilling to sacrifice everything for the distant, tea-obsessed government in London. That spring, the RIC presence all but evaporated in the countryside. Over 700 stations were abandoned. And where the RIC vanished, so too did the British state. In their place sprang up a new system of policing, courts and local administration, one loyal not to the crown, but to the outlawed Dáil. In London, the government seemed to recognise things were slipping out of their control. At a meeting with Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Secretary for War Winston Churchill, military brass pressed for authorisation to go into Ireland, saying they could destroy the rebellion in 3 weeks. But neither Lloyd George nor Churchill wanted to recognise the conflict now taking place as a war, not least because the Dáil might be granted belligerent status. Instead, they declared the unrest was a policing matter, and when it was pointed out that Ireland had barely any Crown police left, they made a decision that would go down in infamy. That year, a recruitment drive began in Britain, one promising decent pay to veterans of World War I willing to go to Ireland. With the economy in recession, many joined up. On arriving in Ireland, they were issued a uniform of khaki trousers and dark green tops, a combination that led to their notorious nickname, the Black and Tans. Even if you're as ignorant of Irish history as most of us Brits sadly are, you've probably heard of the Black and Tans. An 8,000-strong paramilitary force, they were notorious for drunkenness and ruthless violence. And while many myths about them are untrue, they weren't hired from the criminal classes, for example, and they weren't all English, with nearly 40% being Scots, Welsh, or even Irish, their British reputation is, unfortunately, completely earned. From the moment they arrived, the Black and Tans started a campaign of state terror. They ransacked and destroyed homes, practiced collective punishment against villagers. In one representative act, Black and Tans abducted 2 boys with no known connection to the IRA after the lads insulted them. They tied them to the back of one of their lorries and drove at high speed until the boys were mangled beyond recognition before dumping their bodies in a ditch. Grim as the actions of the Black and Tans were, though, they weren't the only paramilitary killers employed by the British state. There were also the Auxiliaries. Although often conflated with the Black and Tans, the Auxiliaries were a separate force, an elite unit of some 2,263 officers who roved Ireland in small, highly mobile groups. They were better trained and better paid than their more infamous counterparts, and they had a lower attrition rate. Some 42% of Black and Tans were killed or wounded, far higher than the Auxies. Yet their brutality was equally legendary. The Auxies were given orders to treat civilians as enemy combatants. If locals didn't put their hands up after one warning, they could be shot. It's even thought the fatal shooting of Ellen Quinn, gunned down in her garden with her baby in her arms, was committed by an Auxiliaries unit. For all these reasons, the regulars of the RIC are said to have hated the men sent to back them up. They'd have shot their own mother, was a common refrain. Yet it was the RIC who'd arguably commit the most impactful murder of all. On March the 19th, 1920, an RIC officer was gunned down in Cork city centre. In retaliation, RIC men went to the home of the local Sinn Fein mayor, Tomás Mac Curtain, and executed him in front of his family. It was a dark, brutal act, but also one that would rebound on the British. In Mac Curtain's place, Terence MacSwiney became Lord Mayor of Cork, and it'd be his actions that would help Ireland win the coming battle for hearts and for minds. By August 1920, Ireland had effectively become ungovernable. Aside from the IRA attacks, there had been a campaign of civil disobedience going all the way from non-payment of taxes to felling telegraph lines and blowing up bridges. It was against this background that Westminster passed the Restoration of Order in Ireland Act, allowing for the mass arrest of hundreds connected to the IRA. Among those jailed was the new Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSwiney. Imprisoned in London, MacSwiney went on a hunger strike. Back in April, a similar strike by arrested Republicans had seen them released after 2 weeks. But this time, the Brits refused to let MacSwiney go free, even though he wasn't personally accused of violence, even though he was the elected mayor of a major city. It was almost like the government couldn't see how this might blow up in their faces, like in the extremely near future, but not before Ireland had descended into a sectarian nightmare. So, we've not talked about them much yet, but the Republicans weren't Ireland's only political force at this time. Up in the north, the 1918 election had returned 26 Unionist MPs, the largest contingent after Sinn Fein. And as the violence spread, a new front was about to open in the war, the sectarian fight between mostly Catholic nationalists and mostly Protestant Unionists. The first spasms came on August the 22nd, 1920. That day, an IRA unit travelled to Lisburn in Ulster, where they assassinated an RIC man. In retaliation, the town's Protestants went on the rampage, attacking Catholic homes and businesses. 300 buildings were burned and scores of Catholic families were expelled. Around the same time, the first in a series of expulsions hit the Belfast shipyards. Catholic workers were attacked, beaten, and driven out by the predominantly Protestant workforce. But it wasn't just Catholics who suffered. In the countryside, the IRA began burning Protestant mansions, driving the wealthy families out into exile. Simultaneously, they stepped up summary executions of those suspected of harbouring pro-British sympathies. In many cases, simply being Protestant was enough to get you shot. This sectarian dimension added an ugly new layer to an already ugly war. And it was about to get uglier still. On September the 20th, 1920, an RIC man was killed at a pub in Balbriggan. Hours later, 140 black and tans descended on the town. They moved from house to house, destroying everything in their path. 50 buildings were razed, and 2 Republicans were beaten to death. Known as the Sack of Balbriggan, the attack was so flagrantly brutal, so despicable, that the world was shocked. Even in Britain, liberals like ex-Prime Minister H.H. Asquith began speaking out against the war, comparing British behaviour to that of the Germans in World War I. But if London looked bad now, things are about to get a whole lot worse. On October the 25th, Terence MacSwiney died in prison over 70 days into his hunger strike. The global reaction was so swift, so outraged, it destroyed what little moral authority Westminster had left. From one of the glorious victors of the Great War, Britain had been reduced to looking like an abusive spouse, brutalising an Ireland that only ever wanted a peaceful divorce. But while government policy would change, it wouldn't change fast enough to head off some of the worst violence yet. On Sunday, November the 22nd, Michael Collins arranged the simultaneous assassination of multiple British intelligence officers known as the Cairo Gang. That day, doors were kicked in, homes entered, and 19 men shot, many in front of their partners. 15 of them died. But it was the response that would go down in infamy. That same afternoon, a group of Auxiliaries entered a Gaelic football match and started firing into the crowd. The shootings and the subsequent stampede killed 14 people, including 3 children, the first massacre in Ireland to earn the moniker Bloody Sunday. Over the following weeks, things only got worse. Auxies murdered and mutilated 2 suspected IRA members in Galway. In return, the IRA ambushed an auxiliary convoy, killing 17. Finally, on the 11th of December, Crown forces marched into Cork and put the city to the torch. As the city centre burned that night, reducing St. Patrick's Street to rubble, it must have felt like the cycle of violence was unstoppable, that the future held nothing but more death and destruction. Yet unbeknownst to anyone, the war was already entering its endgame. In just 7 more months, a peace treaty would have been signed, and Ireland would be on the long road to freedom. In the end, the Irish War of Independence was not concluded thanks to a major military victory, but thanks to simple issues of supplies and politics. On the Republican side, 1921 began with a shortage of weapons and ammo that quickly grew acute. By May, Michael Collins was warning they might not be able to go on fighting much longer, and events seemed to bear that out. When 100 IRA volunteers attacked Dublin's Customs House on May the 25th, setting it on fire, they were defeated by Auxies, who managed to kill 5 and capture 80 of them. A military disaster. Yet, even as supply issues were weakening the Republicans, the issue of politics was causing cluster headaches for London. On December the 23rd, 1920, Westminster had tried to calm the war by issuing the Government of Ireland Act, splitting North and South Ireland into 2 separate territories, each with home rule. It was a classic case of, hey, maybe we'd have done this 2 years ago, it would have worked. But in the current climate, work is exactly what it didn't do. At the Southern Ireland elections that May, Sinn Fein stood nearly unopposed, winning a thumping 124 out of 128 seats in the Home Rule Parliament. They used this victory to repeat demands for independence, demands the world was now listening to more eagerly than ever. That spring, an American fact-finding mission had visited Ireland and been so appalled by British atrocities that President Warren Harding began signalling that he might be open to supporting a free Ireland. With the IRA exhausted and Britain humiliated on the world stage, both sides did the only thing they could. They agreed to talk. At midday on June 11th, 1921, a truce took effect, ending the war's active phase. Not that everyone was eager to observe it. Killings continued right up to the last minute. In Belfast, a battle between snipers that started the previous day killed 19 people overall, including 2 12-year-old Protestant boys and a 13-year-old Catholic girl. On both sides, the snipers deliberately targeted civilians, desperate to inflict one last hit of pain and misery before the truce could take effect. Yet, take effect it did. At the moment the shooting stopped on the Irish War of Independence, some 2,000 people had been killed. About half of the death toll came from the single province of Munster, with 500 dead in Cork alone. In the south, the Protestant minority had been turned into exiles fleeing for the safety of the north. In the north, it was the Catholics who'd fled, a great internal migration that would colour the island's future. Still, as Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith headed to London for negotiations, they were confident that they could get what they wanted, that they could achieve the dream of a free Ireland. But with no decisive victory on the battlefield, Lloyd, George and Churchill would make them swallow some painful compromises. The most painful of all was that there would be no independent Ireland compromising all 32 counties. Instead, the 6 Protestant majority counties of Ulster would remain in the UK as the country of Northern Ireland. This was non-negotiable for the British, as was the issue of full independence. Unwilling to let Ireland become a republic, they insisted instead on it becoming a dominion of the Empire. That would mean officials swearing allegiance to the king. It would mean Britain retaining control of some ports. It would mean autonomy rather than full sovereignty. But if all this sounds like the Brits were dictating terms, the bitterest pill was all London's to swallow. No matter how many conditions were slapped on it, there was no getting around the fact that Ireland would no longer be a colony. For Collins and Griffiths, this was enough. The Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed in December in 1921. On January 7th, 1922, the Dáil narrowly voted to ratify it. The UK province of Southern Ireland ceased to exist, and the political entity that would soon become the Irish Free State was born. Sadly, though, the violence that had consumed the island didn't disappear. In the wake of the Dáil's ratification, the Republicans split into pro- and anti-treaty camps. Before 6 months had passed, the two factions would collapse into civil war, bringing more chaos and bloodshed to the wounded countryside. But you'll have to wait for the third part in our series on Irish history to learn about that. With hindsight, we can see today just how transformative the Irish War of Independence was. Not only did it make one of Western Europe's most famous countries a geopolitical reality, it also prefigured the coming age of decolonisation, of the guerrilla struggles that would soon take place across Europe's great powers in Africa, the Middle East, Asia. It may have taken place on one small island in the Atlantic, but the Irish War of Independence had ramifications that spread out across the entire world. For this reason, it remains relevant not just for Irish people or those descended from the Irish, but for everyone who's interested in modern history.